It's time now for the France 24 debate. Tonight, Pope Francis is in Burma. This could be very much a tricky trip for the pontiff because he's been advised not to mention the word Rohingya. The Pope has previous on this issue. Last August, Francis condemned the treatment of the Rohingya Muslims, His Holiness referring to our Rohingya brothers and sisters, criticising the way they're being pushed around in Burma. In Burma, Pope Francis then has already met with the chief of the army. That is the Burmese army that's been carrying out a campaign against Rohingya Muslims in Rakhine State. Since August, over 600,000 men, women and children have been forced to run for their lives. Their stories have been harrowing.
The Burmese army attacked us. They shot at us and burnt our village, so we had to leave. I saw many dead people as we fled. No one is left in my village, not a single person.
The army came at night as we slept. They started shooting. Some villagers died, others were wounded. Still others escaped by jumping into the river.
Pope Francis is also meeting with one person who's taken the most flack over the Rohingya affair, Aung San Suu Kyi. De facto president of Burma criticised for being silent while slaughter has been taking place. The United Nations has condemned events in Rakhine State as textbook ethnic cleansing. Well, a deal has now been hatched between Burma and Bangladesh to allow the Rohingya refugees to go back to Rakhine State. Few, though, feel safe enough to even begin that return journey. Can Pope Francis help that happen in some kind of safety? Our guests to debate the issue are, starting here in the studio with Jean-Michel Lacombe, former French ambassador to Burma and also to Bangladesh. Thank you, sir, for being with us. Currently a lecturer at Sciences Po. Looking forward to hearing what you've got to say about all the matters in hand. Joining us from afar, by satellite, from Washington, D.C., Priscilla Clapp, former U.S. Chief of Mission in Burma and now an independent consultant. Priscilla, thank you very much for being with us. By Skype, joining us from Bangkok, Phil Robertson, Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch, the Asia Division of that organisation. Phil, good to see you. By Skype from New York, Matthew Smith, co-founder and Chief Executive of Fortify Rights. Matthew, thank you for being with us. Bring you all in a second. In September this year, Aung San Suu Kyi gave a controversial speech where she claimed her government did not fear international scrutiny over its handling of violence in Rakhine State. Later, she was heavily criticised for what some saw as her ongoing reluctance to address the crisis and the government's role in it. Let's take a listen to an interview given that very same day where Suu Kyi talks of the humanitarian and historical social issues that hinder peace.
It's humanitarian issues which have arisen out of long-term socioeconomic problems, because the problems of and political, of course, in the Rakhine State go back to the 19th century. And periodically, trouble has broken out there between the Muslim community and the Rakhine community. And we have inherited this very complex problem, and we have to deal with it, and we have to resolve it. So obviously it's not something that we can do overnight, and it's not something that we can find simple answers to, because building up trust and harmony between two communities that have, in many parts of that region, been hostile to one another, is not done easily.
They sound like fine words coming from the Nobel Peace Laureate Aung San Suu Kyi, but the background information on this one, of course, is such that the Rohingya have been persecuted. I think Jean-Michel Lacombe, Aung San Suu Kyi saying from the 19th century, I think it goes back even further than that, doesn't it, the persecution of the Rohingya?
Well, unfortunately, it goes back to the British Empire, where the way how to handle the British Empire was injecting an ethnic minority in the other part of the empire with the backing of British troops. And Muslims, Bangladeshi Muslims, before Pakistan, Muslims were always present during the British time. And this is why the Burmese consider them as a legacy of colonialism. And they don't consider them as true Burmese. They don't even consider them as an ethnic minority like Kachin, Karen, and so on, who are. And the only difference is that they are Muslim and the color of their skin. The other minority, Christian minorities, are clearly Burmese style. They have the fair skin and more yellow. The Rohingyas, although I shouldn't mention that word, the Rohingyas, the Muslim minorities, are clearly Bangladeshi origin.
We don't mind for 1 second if we offend the Burmese government on this issue, because clearly they've got a lot of questions to answer about how they're treating the Rohingya minority. So no problem with the R word on this debate. Thank you, sir, for your opening remarks. Let's bring in Priscilla Clapp, who's joining us from Washington, former US Chief of Mission in Burma, now independent consultant. Priscilla, the situation. Clearly, we heard Aung San Suu Kyi's words there. When you listen to what she said, do you feel that this is someone who's got a handle on the situation, or someone who's basically paying lip service in some way, shape or form to the people she's working alongside?
Oh, I think she has a good handle on the situation. She is not paying lip service to it, and she has put together a very complex program to bring them back, which is going to face a lot of a long struggle with the military. She is using the civilian government to take on the military right now. And I think that interview that you referred to took place before the events of August, when she was already starting a program to improve the situation for the Rohingya in Rakhine.
So in terms of what happens next, Priscilla, are you envisaging that this will actually work, that they can start going back to Rakhine State?
I'm hoping that that is the case, but it's going to be a very hard struggle. There are so many forces working against this on the ground in Rakhine State and in the country as a whole. But there are also a lot of forces that want to see them come back, including among the Rakhine population, because there has been traditionally a very strong economic codependence between the Rakhine and the Muslims in that state, not just the Rohingya, but others as well, including the Kaman.
Clearly, lots of benefits to coming back. I imagine, bringing in Phil Robertson of Human Rights Watch, who's joining us from Bangkok. Phil, I imagine, and we've been told this from our correspondent, in the minds of many people, the thought of going back, the possibility of what they might find and what might happen next, it's clearly a very scary thought.
Well, it definitely is, because we have documented crimes against humanity that have been committed against these people. We've documented, systematic use of gang rape against women. This is a horrible situation. These people who have ended up in the camps on the Bangladesh side are still suffering from very severe traumas and from loss of family members as they've fled. Discussions that we had interviewing women, who had to decide which of the children they should take to flee with them to Bangladesh because they couldn't take them all. I mean, these are sort of decisions that haunt people for the rest of their lives. And the problem is right now that the discussion is about, okay, having these people go back, which in general is the right direction. But the problem is that the discussions between the Myanmar and the Bangladesh government didn't involve the Rohingya, and it didn't even involve the UN Refugee Agency. So, there's no protection mechanisms in place or even being discussed yet about how these people would go back into arm's length of the Burmese military that just several weeks ago they were fleeing from. I think that there's, if you could say that it's a baby step forward, but, the idea is that both the international community and these two states have to work together to make sure that any sort of return is actually voluntary. It's done, it's rights respecting, it's done in dignity, and that people are allowed to go back to where they came from, not be sent to some sort of open-air detention camp like the one that still exists west of Sittwe. Indeed.
Lots of questions raised by this agreement between Burma, Myanmar, and Bangladesh. And as you rightly point out, Phil, the lack of input, I suppose, from other agencies raises questions. Matthew Smith from Fortify Rights joining us from New York. In the midst of all this, in flies Pope Francis, clearly with a job on his hands to try to use some papal diplomacy and influence to try to bring about some kind of resolution. Do you think he will have any success in that?
Yeah, that's right. I think right now it is timely for the Pope's visit. I hope so. The Pope's visit is timely, and he has consistently preached messages of peace, reconciliation, and promoting human rights. He's specifically referred to the situation in Rakhine State. He's mentioned the Rohingya before, as was mentioned in the lead up to this discussion here. And so I think it is a very important time for the Pope's visit to Myanmar. We are hopeful that it will contribute to some better action. To date, we're beyond concerned about, horrified in many ways about what's been going on in Rakhine State. So there needs to be more attention on the situation now.
Matthew, there is quite a large delay in asking you questions. I shall try to bear that in mind when I throw questions to you and try to bring you in. What I will say to you, sir, is if you want to join the debate at any point, just say, and I will try to bring you in. And that goes for everybody who's joining us from afar. Difficult to sort of monitor these debates and moderate it when people are from elsewhere, but we're glad you're here and your opinions are what we want to hear, not mine. I'll be quiet and bring in Jean-Michel Lacan for another insight into what's happening, because obviously Pope Francis is there. He's already criticised the Burma-Myanmar government.
Well, the Pope has a reputation of not mincing his words.
Which is what's needed, isn't it?
Which is needed. I totally agree with what has just been said. The Rohingya won't go back unless there is an international presence. That's quite clear. Some of them send their family machine gun down, and they are stiff-cared. The Pope, if I may put it that way, has a special interest, whether it's Bangladesh or Burma, in the way minorities, religious minorities or ethnic minorities are treated. Christians in Bangladesh and in Burma are tiny minorities. And therefore, it's for the Pope a very special case and very dear case. And I'm sure the Christian living in both countries as second-class citizens, it has to be said quite clearly, living as second-class citizen will be relieved to see the Pope coming, a clear signal that they have not been forgotten, and the Church is there and thinking about them. And then there is the international role of the Vatican diplomacy, which has always been trying to help and clearing this type of situation and trying to have both sides talk to each other. Now, it's interesting to see that the Burmese government wants things to go right. The General Chief of Staff has met the Pope. It's a clear signal that we don't want any problem.
But that's the man in charge of the military crackdown in Rakhine State.
In Rakhine State. So, it's a clear signal that the Burmese government, the real one in charge of security, not Aung San Suu Kyi.
That's the army, basically.
Yes, that's the army, wants to meet the Pope. They could have done without it.
So, something positive. I need to stop you right there because we're out of time for this first part of our debate, but of course, much more to come in part 2. Stay with us.
Encore, presented by Eve Jackson.
This is a region few travellers visit, a place that for centuries has been the centre of tension and the land fought over. But this tiny area packs in more historical, religious and cultural heritage than perhaps anywhere else in the world. Join us from the Palestinian cities of Bethlehem and Ramallah as we discover an art scene that's full of hope and resistance.
Encore on France 24 and France24.com. Tech 24, presented by Julia Seeger and Dhananjay Kadolkar.
Welcome aboard Energy Observer. This X-racing catamaran powered by hydrogen is on a 6-year voyage around the world. In Tech 24 this week, we'll tell you more about hydrogen. Is it set to become the fuel of the future, powering our cars, homes, and offices? We'll tell you more in this edition.
Tech 24 on France 24 and France24.com. Revisited, presented by Stuart Norval.
On June the 5th, 1967, the Israeli army invaded Egyptian Sinai, unleashing a war that would change the face of the Middle East. During the Six-Day War, Israel took rapid possession of the Golan Heights, the West Bank and the Old City of Jerusalem, holy sites for Jews, Muslims and Christians alike. It's a stranglehold that the Israeli authorities have maintained to this day.
The Temple Mount and the Western Wall will forever remain under Israeli sovereignty.
50 years later, East Jerusalem still symbolizes the ascendancy of Israel, whose settlements policy has created tensions which are as strong today as ever and make the atmosphere in Jerusalem unique in the world.
Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.
Isn't it? Welcome back. This is live from Paris, the France 24 debate on the Pope in Burma, Myanmar, coming up very shortly. Let's remind you of the headlines. And that's where we start. Don't mention the Rohingya. That's the advice to Pope Francis in Burma. He's been advised to avoid the R word because it causes offence. He's already had a 15-minute meeting with the military chief, the man who led the violent crackdown in Rakhine State. That ended with an exchange of gifts. He's to meet Aung San Suu Kyi later. The EU has relicensed the weed killer glyphosate for a further 5 years. France wanted a ban, but was outvoted. The World Health Organization says that the substance causes cancer. President Macron says this globally popular weed killer will be unilaterally banned within France within the next 3 years. A Pakistani cabinet minister has been forced to resign after deadly riots this weekend. It's all tied to claims of blasphemy and an Islamist party pressuring that man out of office. And Prince Harry is to marry actress Meghan Markle next spring. The announcement follows months of media speculation in the UK. Prince Harry asking permission from his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, as well as from Meghan's parents in Los Angeles. Welcome back to part 2 of the France 24 debate. The Rohingyas return. Can the Pope help this happen safely? Our guests to discuss the issues and what's at stake in the studio, Jean-Michel Lacan, former French ambassador to Burma and to Bangladesh, now lecturer at Sciences Po. Thank you, sir, for being with us. Joining us by satellite from Washington, D.C., Priscilla Clapp, former U.S. Chief of Mission in Myanmar, Burma, now an independent consultant. Priscilla, thank you for being with us. By Skype from Bangkok, Phil Robertson, who is Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch, the Asia division of that. Thank you too, sir, for joining us. And by Skype from New York, Matthew Smith, co-founder and Chief Executive of Fortify Rights. Thank you all for being with us. Let's bring in Priscilla Clapp from Washington, former U.S. Chief of Mission in Myanmar, Burma. Some say Burma, some say Myanmar. I think it depends on where you come from and what you believe. But anyway, there we go. Priscilla, the situation when you were in Myanmar, clearly you witnessed many things. You saw how things work. Will the Pope be someone who is listened to by the government, by the people in power in Burma?
Yes, I think that the Pope carries enormous moral authority there, as he does elsewhere in the world. And Pope Francis has demonstrated his willingness to wade into very, very difficult situations all over the world. I think he will make a difference. He is meeting with all sides of this issue, which is very wise on his part, and I think that he will bring a general message of tolerance and understanding to all of them. It will be most interesting to me to see his meeting with the militant ultranationalist monks. They are a minority within the Buddhist religion in the country, but they are a very loud voice that has stoked much of the violence against Muslims that has occurred in the last few years.
Given the separation and given the natural prejudice that people appear to have, do you think those kind of people, the people who should we would hope, hear the Pope's words, you think basically they'll have deaf ears towards that?
It's hard to say. They generally have deaf ears towards reason, and they have their own political agenda. But I think it is always useful to encourage dialogue. And the Pope will speak with much more moral authority than those monks have. So I think the world will be listening to him.
Priscilla, thank you. Phil Robertson from Human Rights Watch in Bangkok. The question I'm putting to you is one I'd like everybody's thoughts on, really. When the Pope meets Aung San Suu Kyi, how will that conversation go?
Well, I think they've met before. You know, she has been to the Vatican, so this is not a new relationship for either of them. I mean, what I'm hoping is that there will be a wider discussion about non-discrimination and equal treatment of religion and right to worship, because, you know, the issue of freedom of religion, freedom to worship in Myanmar is much larger than just the Rohingya. There are, you know, no-go zones for Muslims in some parts of the country. There are difficulties for Kachin Baptists to build churches and get permission to build churches. You know, there are problems with Christians in Sagaing Division who cannot effectively get the access to public facilities to hold worship services. You know, there's an ongoing pattern of discrimination against minority religions, either by law or by practice in Myanmar, that needs to be addressed. And, you know, this is the sort of thing that I would hope he would discuss with her, because in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country like Myanmar, you can't have these kind of issues fester. They have to be dealt with fairly forthrightly, and they have to be done in a way that is non-discriminatory and ultimately, I think, seen as being fair. Otherwise, you know, if the government is taking sides one way or the other, it creates a situation where some groups, as like the sort of the minority of extremist monks, as Priscilla mentioned, start taking advantage of that and start causing problems.
Phil, thank you. I'll bring in Matthew in a moment. I'll just go quickly back to Priscilla for a thought on that one. We heard what Phil was hoping for about more diversity, recognised more tolerance of religions. The very diversity of Burmese society, Myanmar society, is that essentially the problem?
Well, it's a combination of diversity and 55 years of authoritarian, cruel authoritarian military rule in which the many minorities were deliberately kept apart and not allowed to interact with each other. So they're playing catch-up now, and it's always difficult with a society that is as diverse as this country, both in terms of ethnicity and religion, to overcome differences when they haven't been communicating with each other for more than half a century.
Priscilla, thank you very much indeed. Matthew Smith in New York. Matthew, in terms of what you would hope Aung San Suu Kyi would do, in terms of what you'd hope she could achieve in this conversation with the Pope, what would you be looking for?
Thanks. Well, I think it would be very important for Pope Francis to speak directly with Aung San Suu Kyi about the military's attacks on the civilian population, about the massacres that have occurred, about the denial of humanitarian aid, also about the ongoing conflict in Kachin and Shan states as well. What we would hope for from Aung San Suu Kyi would be commitments to more firmly address these issues. As of now, up to now, particularly in the last 12 months, Aung San Suu Kyi's office has actually been part of the problem. The military has been perpetrating these violations against the Rohingya and others, but her offices have been shaping public opinion in the wrong directions. They've been issuing outright denials about the human rights violations. We would like to see that change. We would like to see an acknowledgement about what's been happening. Aid groups still do not have access to the areas they need to be accessing. So we would like to see urgently, we would like to see that change. And, you know, much more significant legal fixes need to be addressed as well.
Matthew, thank you very much indeed. I'll bring in our guests in a moment after. a look at how the visit has gone so far for the Pope. The Pope, of course, in Burma to speak to the authorities there, including Aung San Suu Kyi, about the situation regarding the Rohingya Muslims.
Burma's army chief and head of security for Rakhine State, General Maya-Anaïs, leaves after a 15-minute meeting on the Rohingya crisis with Pope Francis. The Vatican spokesman says they talked about the great responsibility of the country's authorities. The ongoing humanitarian crisis in Rakhine State has sent more than 600,000 Muslim Rohingyas fleeing to Bangladesh. But most Burmese deny they're being persecuted and reject even the name Rohingya because it legitimizes them as an ethnic group.
It's going to be tricky if he uses the word Rohingya, I think, because most people can't accept it.
My feeling is that if the Pope is going to talk about the Rakhine State issue, the people aren't going to like him anymore.
The Pope hasn't shied away from using the name for the Muslim minority group in the past, a taboo in majority Buddhist Burma, where they've been discriminated against for decades.
They have been tortured, killed, simply because they want to live their culture and their Muslim faith.
With its vast Buddhist majority, the Pope doesn't hold particular sway in Burma, but he's still walking into a highly charged political situation. Francis will meet with the country's de facto leader, Aung San Suu Kyi.
Of course, there is this worry. If he says something, people might say that, okay, he just came to meddle. So I think a lot of diplomacy is needed.
Some fear that if the Pope gets it wrong, not only will it not help the Rohingyas, but might also lead to a backlash against Burma's minority Catholics, who make up just 1% of the population.
Interesting question raised by one of the interviewees in that report by Yenna Lee. Diplomacy or meddling? I suppose it's a very fine dividing line, and Pope Francis now walking along that particular tightrope. Let's bring in Jean-Michel Lacombe here in the studio for more on this. I mean, you pointed out earlier, Jean-Michel, that the difference between the Rohingya Muslims and the rest, if you like, is made worse, exacerbated by the fact that A, Muslim, but B, they're of a different colour. How can one get past that kind of prejudice? Because this is something that is common around the world. Prejudice, sadly, we all live with it. But in their situation, it's discrimination, it's prejudice, it's denial of any kind of citizenship, denial of rights.
I think this should be put back into a political perspective.
Okay.
The West accepted a compromise with that constitution handed over and sharing of power. We had a hope that if the country opens up, accept internet, globalize its economy, the consequence will be almost automatically a change in the minds and the way the country is run and so on. It might take a long time, but things like that, I mean, the way the Rohingyas are treated.
And you were party to those discussions that were going on about that opening up of the country.
Yes. That was what, and the Chinese agreed more or less, and the Russian agreed. We can't go on like that. This is a 19th century type of a regime. Sure. It's almost Korean. So the result was a bet. Was a bet. We open up. We tell them that we lift up some sanctions, part of them. Targeted sanctions still are going on, but and then this is that can be considered as a big setback. But we must go on. There is no other way. And the visit of the Pope is helping. It's a step in the right direction, and I'm glad, like all the Christians in Bangladesh or Burma, both cases, second-class citizens, they must be so happy to see the Pope. I insisted already on this, to have the Pope to come and see them and pray with them.
I think we were getting that from the report, people pleased to see the Pope there, but warning that if he uses the word Rohingya, as you said earlier on, that could cause very big problems. Jean-Michel, thank you for the moment. Let's bring in Phil Robertson from Bangkok, Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch Asia. Phil, we've heard about the political context, the bet that was made that the Burmese authorities at the time would honour the commitment to open up the country and be fairer. Perhaps that was, looking back, naive, and obviously retrovision is always 24, isn't it? 2020 rather, should I say. In terms of what happens next, bringing people back seems like almost a foolhardy idea, something that anybody in their right minds probably wouldn't go along with.
Well, we're concerned that, Bangladesh may slowly lose patience over a period of time, bearing this very, very heavy burden of over 620,000 Rohingya who have fled to Bangladesh. I mean, Bangladesh should be commended for keeping its borders open and for allowing the humanitarian assistance in. And, it's very interesting that you can really sort of compare and contrast the treatment in Bangladesh, where the humanitarians have been able to get in, where there's been access, where there's been, a good working relationship between the government and the international NGOs, vis-a-vis what we see across the border in northern Rakhine State, where access is extremely limited. WFP has just gotten back in, but only in a minimal way. Basic assistance and supplies have not reached those in need who are still in northern Rakhine State. I mean, it's still a major problem. I agree with Matt that the Pope has to raise these issues of humanitarian access and human rights, and not only in northern Rakhine State, but also in other places where there are ongoing battles and these kind of Burmese military tactics perpetrated against ethnic peoples, whether they be Kachin or Shan or Ta'ang or others. And I do want to emphasize, I think that the Pope does have to publicly speak and say Rohingya, because the Rohingya have lost so much, and it's important to continue to support their right to self-identify. I think that this is an issue that there really can't be much compromise on. He has to say those words, and he has to say them on Burmese soil. I think that's important. He doesn't have to say it every single time, but the thing is, he has to make it clear that he does stand with the right of this group to self-identify as a group. That is a basic core human right, and it has to be upheld. Indeed.
They've been denied everything. They're being hit. They're being killed, slaughtered. What's been going on in Rakhine State is beyond our comprehension, I think. And Phil, I think you've really hit the nail on the head in summarising a lot of that. Can I bring in Priscilla from Washington once again? Priscilla, with your angle on this as the former US Chief of Mission in Myanmar, what do you think the kind of pressures are that are going on right now between Burma, Myanmar and Bangladesh? The kind of issues they're discussing. Obviously, Bangladesh can't take this massive influx of people. The funds aren't there. The ability to help is obviously stretched to its thinnest.
Yes, there's not a long history of close relations between Bangladesh and Myanmar, in spite of the fact that they share a border. So they're dealing with each other in a much more intense way than they have probably ever. And I think it's a test of the relationship to see how this develops. But at any rate, I'm encouraged so far that they have managed to reach agreement on the terms of return. And we will see how this process proceeds. It's going to be very, very difficult. But I think we have to bear in mind, as we look at the tragedy before us here, that this is a test. It is a defining moment right now for the future of democracy in Burma. And the civilian government is taking on an enormous task in going against the military to bring these people back. And I think we should all be supporting what they're trying to do, however imperfect it may be. We cannot make things happen if we demand perfection before anything is allowed to start.
Thousands, though, have been killed, Priscilla. That's the great imperfection about it all, isn't it? What can we expect from Aung San Suu Kyi realistically?
Well, I think that she is trying very hard to open the country for democratic rule, but we have to remember that the military still controls everything on the ground in the country, including the civilian administration of the country.
Priscilla, thank you very much indeed. I'm just wondering whether there's a feeling that Aung San Suu Kyi is doing everything she possibly can. Obviously, she's been very widely criticised. Matt Smith first, and then Phil Robertson after that. Matt, in New York.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I was just recently on the border with Myanmar, the border between Myanmar and Bangladesh. There are still thousands of refugees pouring across. They are fleeing, in some cases, violence, threats of violence, serious human rights violations. There was, of course, a massive attack on the civilian population in August and September, and last year as well. That has settled down, but the fundamental problems in northern Rakhine State have not been addressed. So this agreement between Bangladesh and Myanmar is in many ways grossly premature. As Phil mentioned, it didn't involve the Rohingya population. It didn't involve the UN agency tasked with these types of issues, the UN Refugee Agency. So it's problematic on a number of fronts, but most importantly, there are still refugees coming across the border. I'll say this as well. You know, there's a history of forced repatriations. In the 70s, 80s, and 90s, Myanmar authorities, the military, was involved in what were effectively forced repatriations of Rohingya back to northern Rakhine State. So the Rohingya people have been through this before. This is not about a civilian leadership pushing up against the military. This is actually a repetition of the same patterns of violations that this community has been enduring for decades.
Matt Smith, thank you very much indeed. Phil Robertson, over to you.
Yeah, I would say a couple things. First of all, one of the things that Aung San Suu Kyi should do, which she hasn't done, as foreign minister, she should grant visas to the UN Human Rights Council appointed fact-finding mission led by Marzuki Darusman, the former Attorney General of Indonesia, including Radhika from Sri Lanka and also Chris Sidoti from Australia, to come into the country and conduct a real international standard independent investigation about what has happened in northern Rakhine State. It's still been a puzzlement to us why she has not allowed that to happen. This is a Human Rights Council mandated process. I would think that they would stand to benefit from being involved in the research that they're going to do and being able to present their side of the story. But for whatever reason, that mission has been stymied, despite the best efforts by the international community. I mean, foreign diplomats in Yangon, but also people in New York and Geneva and others to try to persuade the Myanmar authorities to let them in, and they've just gotten nowhere.
Phil, I need to cut you off there. I'm very sorry. Philip, I need to cut you off there, sir. Sorry about that. We're nearly out of time. I'm really sorry, Phil. I'm really sorry. Final word from Jean-Michel.
I just wanted to explain what is being a second-class citizen. There has always been a special administration in that part of Burma. It was called Nasaka. And it meant that if you wanted to get married, you were not allowed to get married. You had to go to Bangladesh. If you wanted to move from one town to another, you have to ask permission, special permission, special card, and so on. It was...
so no control over their life, basically.
I mean, a very special administration with police everywhere and impossible to go to court,
indeed,
for instance.
Jean-Michel, I need to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. My apologies to Phil Robertson of Human Rights Watch in Bangkok for cutting you off, sir. Time was against us, but thank you. Thanks to all the guests here. And it's time now for our Media Watch segment.